Thank you for joining. Today we cover medical device and software as medical device market entry across 6 Southeast Asia countries in about 40 minutes. So please post questions in the Q&A session as we go. We will take them at the end. The recording will be made available after the event. And just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Sochan and I am the Vice President of Southeast Asia for Cisema, and joining me today is Victoria.
Yeah, hi, I'm Business Development and Marketing Director here at Cisema.
So for 5 sections today, we're going to focusing on why Southeast Asia, the classification and product groupings, the pathways and timelines, what are the benefits of having a third-party license holding and authorized representative to represent you in the Southeast Asia market. And at the end of this webinar, we will be giving a Q&A sessions. And so please post your questions in the Q&A box, and the recordings will be made available after this event.
Thanks, Xiaozhen. So first up today is we have looking at why Southeast Asia. Obviously, the market case is fairly straightforward. They are fast-growing economies, there's high import dependency, and the regulatory frameworks are becoming more and more accessible in the last 2 to 3 years. So let's take a look at some of the numbers. So here we have an overview of the domestic medical device consumption. So here the 6 markets in 2024 combined represent almost $11 billion US. And they're expected to grow to around 16 billion by the end of the decade. So that's a 50% expansion in just under 6 years. The structural drivers that are underpinning every market in this ASEAN group of countries are mainly structural. So aging populations, rapid expansion of the national health insurance coverage, and sustained government investment in hospital infrastructure. Thailand and Malaysia are the 2 largest domestic markets at just over 2 billion and 3 billion respectively, but they both have the lowest growth rates in the group. They've already got really well-developed infrastructure and a relatively high device penetration rate already, which is why the growth here is fairly incremental rather than structural. In terms of Vietnam, this is the most compelling entry point in these ASEAN 6 countries. It's got currently, well, in 2024, the value was 1.5 billion, and the compounded annual growth rate was well over 8.5%. And 90% of its devices are imported. The regulatory timelines there are improving significantly, especially since the decree overhaul in 2023. And the Class A and B devices are now receiving almost immediate approvals. There's fairly low penetration at the moment, obviously, and really good growth. It presents a really great opportunity for entering the market there. Singapore is the smallest market at just over $1 billion in absolute terms, but the functions as the region's gateway, as a regulatory gateway for these other countries. The Health Sciences Authority approvals are recognised in Thailand and the Philippines, and making it basically essential regardless of its domestic size. The Philippines has the highest growth rate at well over 9%, and 99% of its devices are imported. The Universal Healthcare Act is expanding coverage for previously uninsured populations there, and the Singapore and Malaysia Reliance pathway now helps with fast-track registration there. So it's also presenting good opportunities. And Indonesia is the largest absolute opportunity at over 2 billion in 2024 and growing to almost 3.5 billion expected by the end of the decade. And that's driven by nearly universal insurance coverage now and their ongoing hospital infrastructure investment across their almost 300 million people. So the strategic implication here is that there's no single market that serves all the purposes. So Singapore is very much used for regulatory leverage, Vietnam and Indonesia for volume, Malaysia for Reliance co-registration. So the right entry sequence depends on your product class and your price point. So now we'll have a look at the classification and groupings. Over to you, Xiaozhen.
Thank you, Victoria. So classification is where most of the manufacturers makes their first mistake. Getting the risk class wrong triggers complete resubmissions of your applications. In this session, we will cover the ASEAN Medical Device Directive, AMDD framework, how it applies to software and the grouping strategies that are going to help you to reduce the number of applications that you're going to file. Now, ASEAN member, they actually states the risk-based classification system is very similar to the European Union or the GHTF models. Medical devices, including software, are being classified into class A, B, C, D. Here, as you can see here, some of the local regulations like Thailand actually classified them differently as class 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the key points on classification is that for class A medical devices, they are low-risk medical devices. And for example, a software providing simple wellness info or the archival data without critical impact. Normally in ASEAN, this is a class A, or in Europe, it is a class 1 product. Class B is a moderate risk medical devices, provides monitoring or diagnostic information for non-serious conditions or aids clinical management but not in critical situations. And Class C is a moderate high-risk medical devices, drives clinical management of the illness situation or used to diagnose or treat diseases. For example, an AI diagnostic tool for cancer imaging will be most probably classified as a Class C medical device. And Class D medical devices are critical for sustaining human life or could pose life-threatening risk if it fails. So these classifications are determined by the intended use and the potential impact on the patient outcomes. So we need to make sure that when you apply the classification rule, we need to ensure your intended use of your product fulfills the classification itself. For example, if a software failures could result in a death of serious injury, it results in a higher product classification. And in this slide, we are going to talk about SaMD, software as medical device, and its classification. So what is actually a software as medical device? SaMD is a software that is intended to diagnose, treat, prevent, monitor, or alleviate a disease or condition without being part of a hardware. And the word intended carries legal weight. If your marketing claims and instructions for use form part of the evidence regulators use to determine the intended purpose. Classification follows the same Class A to Class D as hardware. So for example, Class A, if let's say your software that has no medical purpose at all, it is exempted from registration. Class B covers non-serious conditions or software that informs but does not drive a clinical decision. And Class C covers serious conditions or software that is actively drive a clinical decision and a full dossier is required for registration. And Class D is reserved for sustaining or irreversible consequence situations. And Singapore Class C is commercially significant because so far HSA in Singapore does not apply Class D medical device to software, but each country within Southeast Asia region being governed by different regulatory authorities. So we need to make sure that even though the product is being classified as a Class C or a Class D in Singapore, for example, it could be classified as a Class B or a Class C, a lower risk in other regions as well. And for the boundary question is that sometimes people are asking, if my product itself is actually used to track the steps only, it is just monitoring the sleep or fitness itself, and there is no medical claim, typically these are actually exempted from registration because these are not being classified as a software as a medical device. And for the gray zone is a software that presents clinical data. All right, if you can see here, that tells clinician what to diagnose or prescribe. And for the rule of thumb is that if the software output directly changes the clinical management, then it is a software as a medical device. So when it is in doubt, please classify your product accordingly. And for the software as medical device dossier requirements, typically we are looking at 3 types, the 3 areas. The first area is that the software life cycle, which is normally documented under IEC 62304. For Class B and above, regulators expect evidence of a structured software development life cycles, version control records, defect tracking logs, software validation and verification report, and a risk management file with software-specific hazards under the ISO 14971. Now, if your SaMD was built by a third-party developer, their documentation is part of your dossier. So you need to get it before you start the dossier preparation. The second criteria that we are looking at is clinical and algorithm evidence. Clinical evaluation for software as medical device must address whether the algorithm actually works, not just whether it is safe. You need to training dataset demographics and size and independent validation cohorts and performance metrics, such as the sensitivity or the specificity. The reference document in Singapore is HSA AIML Software as Medical Device Guidance published back in 2002. And the third one, which is right now most of the Southeast Asia countries are trying to implement, is the cybersecurity and the post-market. Now, Singapore and Malaysia now treat this as a standard dossier element. So for the minimum requirement is that there must have at least a cybersecurity risk assessment, a software bill of materials listing all third-party components, and a patch management policy. On the post-market surveillance, software as medical device submissions must include a monitoring plan for algorithm drift, the risk that model performance degrades as the real-world populations diverge from the training data. So Singapore HSA explicitly require this, define the metrics. You need to monitor the frequency and the threshold that triggers the corrective action. And when we talk about medical device grouping, this is an essential element because this will help the manufacturers to reduce the workload and, of course, the cost itself. And in Southeast Asia, normally medical devices are being divided into 6 groups, which is a single, family, system, set, IVD test kit, and IVD cluster. And for most of the software, if you only has a single model software, typically it is being classified as a single grouping. And for family-wise, normally we use this grouping if, let's say, the manufacturers are the same, they have the same intended purpose and the same name, and it is just that there are some permissible variants within the group itself. For example, difference in the sizes, difference in the length itself. So we can use this as a family grouping. And for the system-wise, most common system used will be the ultrasound diagnostic system. This is where a grouping applies when multiple products are being intended to work together to complete an intended purpose, because like an ultrasound diagnostic system, there are probes, there are ultrasound machines, so normally we group them as a system. A set grouping is actually being grouped together from a different manufacturers, and actually they are packaged together and supplied for one single purpose. One of the common example under set is a first aid kit, where in the first aid kit itself, there are bandages, there are thermometers actually being packaged together and manufactured by different manufacturers. And another one grouping is IVD test kit. So IVD test kits allows the components to be grouped together in a diagnostic workflow to be registered together, while the IVD cluster allows the IVD products that has the same testing methodology to be grouped together. So if you can see, the key takeaway here is that each of the country within Southeast Asia, they have their own grouping requirement. For example, in certain countries like Indonesia or the Philippines, if the accessories are being sold separately, which means that you have to make sure that the accessory is another application to be registered. And a new thing to be informed is that this is a common information to be shared to the audience, is that in case you're going to register your medical devices in Indonesia, so let's say in Indonesia you have about 10,000 product codes in one family grouping. In Indonesia, at the moment, one application is only capped about 500 product codes in one grouping. So if let's say if you have 1,000 applications to be registered, then 1,000 product codes to be registered, which means that you have to split that into 2 applications to be submitted in Indonesia. So while every country's trying to align with the ASEAN Medical Device Directive, they do still have their own grouping criteria that we still need to follow. So this is where grouping can deliver real efficiencies, but as mentioned, we need to make sure it is being approached carefully. On the left side are situations where groupings usually makes great sense. If products share the same quality management system, manufactured at the same site, and are being supported by essentially the same technical documents, then we can group together. But let's say if the product have a different name, different manufacturing sites, probably their QMS scope is already different, then we have to separate them into a separate application. So refers to the local grouping criteria when you carry out the registration of your products to make sure that the product that you intend to register fulfills the local grouping criteria. So on to you, Victoria, on this one.
So we've taken a look at what your product is and how to group it efficiently. Now the practical question is, how long does it take to register? What does it cost? How long does it help if you have a reference country approval? Does it change those timelines? So let's take a look. Here we're taking a look at standard registration timelines. So these are approximate timelines for class B to D. So this is where a manufacturer is submitting through the normal regulatory process. Obviously, timelines will vary depending on the final device classification, the actual quality of your final dossier, the regulator's workload themselves, and the country-specific requirements. But this chart gives you a useful indication of the relative complexity of each market. The first observation is that obviously ASEAN is not a single regulatory market, even though we have the ASEAN Medical Device Directive. Approval timelines do vary significantly between countries. At first glance, the differences may not appear dramatic, but the strategic implications can be significant. What stands out that there's no clear relationship between regulatory maturity and approval speed. So Singapore is widely regarded as the region's most advanced authority and has some of the longest timelines for the higher risk devices. And it reflects its regulatory philosophy focused on a deeper technical review rather than administrative efficiency. By contrast, you have Indonesia, which delivers shorter timelines, but it is considered as a more challenging market operationally. And that is an important distinction between regulatory complexity and regulatory speed. So a market can be administratively demanding and move applications relatively quickly once they do actually enter. Another interesting observation is that the spread obviously between countries widens as the device increases. So if we take a look at Class B devices, they pretty much fall within a relatively narrow range. But when we get to Class D, the difference between the fastest and the slowest exceeds over a year. So manufacturers of high-risk products, the order of country selection becomes far more important. And here, on average, you can expect something between 8 to 10 months for Class B to D registrations when there are no recognised reference market approvals. So these are the standard registrations when you're going in with no reference countries. It does become particularly of interest and relevant when these standard timelines are then compared with the accelerated and Reliance pathways that some of these markets offer. It's not simply that they reduce the review time, is that they can materially change the order at which manufacturers may enter the region. So let's take a look at those accelerated entries with international approvals. So what are they? So if you have a US FDA clearance, a CE mark, Health Canada, TGA from Australia, Japanese approval, you can not start from zero in Southeast Asia. So you literally have a procedural advantage in at least 3 of these 6 markets, and that's namely Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Thailand here is in brackets, and it really depends on the device classification and the pathway requirements. So that's on a need to review that on a dossier basis. So what does recognising an approval actually mean? And that actually varies by market. So in Malaysia and Singapore, it triggers a structured, expedited pathway that really reduces the review timeline. Vietnam, it can reduce the number of technical queries, especially for Class D and C, but it doesn't activate a formal fast track, as it were. Singapore, as you'll see at the bottom of the list of the reference agencies on the left, is actually its own reference or reliance country, and it actually unlocks shorter routes within Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. So the thing to note here is that it is recognition of the approval decision. So it isn't the actual certificate necessarily itself. So the ASEAN intended use is, if you're thinking of having an intended use that is a little bit broader than what you've actually got written on your reference approval certificate, then you will need to obviously address that gap in your dossier. Taking a look at these registration pathways and trying to understand the difference between these countries, is here that we have sort of a look at 3 different scenarios with the sort of the FDA Reliance approval at the top, if you're going sort of first in world scenario, or whether you have an emergency product. And it varies obviously from country to country, and really it sort of groups these countries into 3 different groups. So on one end of the spectrum we have Singapore, which is the most Reliance-based regulator, and it places a lot of weight on approvals from these trusted reference markets, as we've already mentioned. And it's a fairly predictable registration process. Within the middle of the group, we've got Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. These are what we know as hybrid markets, where your foreign approval can be helpful and that can support the review process, but they don't really eliminate the need for local assessment. And so you should expect a meaningful regulator review and some country-specific documentation requirements. And then Indonesia sits right at the other end of the spectrum. It's fairly independent. Even though it's improving its regulatory framework in the last few years, it really has local administrative requirements. It has local registration holder obligations, and the regulator will play a larger role in reviewing those dossiers. So here you really sort of can't approach the ASEAN as a single market. You really need to have a tiered approach. So for Singapore, the focus is of usually leveraging your existing approvals. For hybrid markets, it depends on adapting to the local requirements. And for Indonesia, it really is working with the local regulatory processes, and those timelines become quite important. So the real differentiator is how much each regulator relies on approvals and how much evidence is generated in other jurisdictions. So let's hand over now to Xiaozhen to take a look at these registration timelines for international reference agencies.
Thank you, Victoria. So if you can see, this chart actually illustrates one of the key realities in ASEAN medical device registrations. Harmonization does not necessarily mean harmonized timelines. The bar compare approximate registration timelines for Class B, C, D medical devices across the 6 ASEAN markets when approval from a recognized reference regulator is already made available. Examples that we mentioned including Health Canada, US FDA, or Japan MHLW. Now, the first observation is that the timeline generally increases as the device risk increases. This is particularly evident in Singapore, where Class B devices can move relatively quickly, but additional review requirements for higher risk products results in longer timelines for Class C and Class D medical devices. Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia demonstrate the most consistent timeline across risk classes. For manufacturing seeking rapid market entry, these countries can often provide relatively predictable approval pathways once you have all the necessary documentation in place. And for the Philippines and Vietnam stands out as the longest pathway for higher risk medical devices. So for Vietnam, A and B can be done within almost immediate, but C and D, it can be done between 9 to 15 months. So this is just an average. Another important point is that the reliance doesn't mean automatic approval, because all 6 countries increasingly, while they recognize international approvals, each regulator still performs its own regulatory assessment and applies the local requirement for each of the product that being applied. So the extent of that assessment varies considerably between each of the countries. From a strategic perspective, this means that manufacturers should not assume that a successful submission in one ASEAN country can be simply replicated across the region. So on average, it takes about 5 to 6, 7 months in ASEAN to get the registration done if you have reference countries. If you do not have reference countries, it could take about 8 to 10 to 12 months. But of course, as mentioned earlier, the timelines varies between each countries and the regulator. Now, we do have a recommendation registration strategy in case you have a Class B medical device that you're going to get the registration done based on the reference country's approval. So because Vietnam normally recognizes Class B medical device as the fastest, so you can get approval within 2 weeks. And the good news is that there's no expiration date once the product has been registered. And for Malaysia and Singapore, normally you can get a registration in parallel because if you have Singapore approvals, which means that you are able to unlock the registration in Thailand and Philippines in the next phase. And normally Indonesia, they sit outside the Reliance network as long as you have a valid ISO 13485 certificate and a valid free sale certificate, then you are able to get the registration done in Indonesia. What differentiates Indonesia and other regions is that at the moment, one brand can only be held by one license holder. So it is very important for you to find a third-party license holder to get a registration in Indonesia. And here are actually our market entry strategy for fast tracking your Class B medical devices. So if you can see here is that everything else comes in that Vietnam can be done in 2 weeks, Singapore at 5 months, Malaysia is about 4 to 6 months if you have a reference country's approval. Thailand will be unlocked after 7 months once you get the Singapore approval, and Philippines, you can get the registration done about 6 months as well if you use the Singapore's approval. So basically, you need to make sure that in case you plan to launch your medical devices in Southeast Asia, planning is important. So get the registration done in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam first, followed by Thailand and Philippines, because remember that if you have approvals from Singapore, then or Malaysia, then you're actually able to fast track your registration in Thailand and the Philippines markets. And so I'm going to hand this over to Victoria. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiaozhen. So taking a look at software as a medical device, it actually follows the same market entry sequence as for hardware or normal medical devices. But there are 3 specific points regarding software that we would like to highlight. Vietnam is the fastest entry for Class A and B. It takes around about 1 month, but it doesn't operate a formal Reliance pathway for Class C and D. And those classes take around about 3 to 6 months, regardless of the international reference approvals. So the idea is here, file your full product family here first. It's a great way of getting into the market. And as we know, 90% of their domestic market is reliant on approvals, and their growth is phenomenal. In terms of Singapore, as we mentioned earlier on, the Class C is the highest category. So this is a real advantage for any high-risk software, especially sort of AI tools that would normally be classified as a Class D in Malaysia or Indonesia. So the idea is really get registered within Singapore first, as you have that as a Reliance portal to then get into Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand as the potential lower risk category. Class B is fast track, is around about 100 days for Singapore, and a Class C is 160 working days. And the last thing to note here, the third point, is that for both phase 2 markets of Philippines and Thailand, is that they're now looking at requiring the Singapore HSA algorithm performance evidence into all of the dossiers. So that means you're going to need to provide your training data set, demographics, your validation metrics. Basically, the regulators are looking to, even on abridged submissions, they will be looking for that, and they will delay your review if you have to produce this mid-process. So again, here is just a quick diagram to show that obviously that it's the same fast track for software as for normal devices, with roughly the 12 months outer boundary if you plan this correctly. Obviously, Thailand going via Singapore is the longest pathway to market, taking roughly the full 12 months. And Indonesia and Vietnam can ideally run in parallel from day one because neither require the Singapore reference. But obviously, do remember to plan your Philippines and Thailand dossiers in advance of your Singapore approval, and so that you can then submit within days of getting that approval from Singapore, rather than waiting weeks to prepare your dossier. That means that you can actually optimize the full plan for the whole of these 6 ASEAN markets to actually enter all 6 markets within the full 12 months. Just a little note here on other pathways. Really, these are more sort of accelerated pathways rather than abridged. Apologies for the title there. So here, there is a bit of a misconception that all of the countries have some equivalent of the FDA Breakthrough Device Program or some kind of innovation pathway. In reality, it is really only Singapore that is the one that is fully equipped for all kinds of mechanisms, from innovation review to Reliance-based expedited reviews we've already seen, as well as emergency and special access programs. So depending on your circumstances and the market circumstances, Singapore gives you the opportunity to get into the market in various ways. The other 5 countries do offer some form of accelerated or special access pathways, but they're mainly focused on emergency access due to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And they're mainly available for sort of public health emergencies or critical supply shortages or urgent clinical needs. Indonesia and Philippines have the most developed emergency use authorization outside of Singapore. And Malaysia and Thailand do have both emergency and special access mechanisms, but they tend to be more discretionary and depend on specific government or clinical procurement needs at the time. Vietnam does have a fast track and emergency import mechanisms, but in practical implementation can vary and really do depend on local circumstances. So it depends on the specific device in question. Obviously, not all devices can access these pathways, but it's good to be aware that these pathways do exist and they are developing since the pandemic. They're becoming obviously more flexible since COVID. So it's, it is leading to more reliance, more conditional approvals, but also more remote inspections and more post-market based regulation. So you need to be aware of that as well. Okay, so next, we're going to take a look at license holding and authorised representation, what that means for the markets. Over to you, Xiaozhen.
Thank you, Victoria. So let's talk a bit about license holding when it comes to Southeast Asia market. So Cisema actually operates with 2 types of license holding model in Southeast Asia country. The first model is the acting as a license holder because of the local regulatory requirements. This applies to countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Basically, we are the license holder and register the products under the local entity. And once we have successfully registered the products, we will just be issuing a letter of authorization to the appointed importer and distributor for them to import and distribute medical devices. But when it comes to countries like Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, the regulatory models is actually different compared to the license holding model in Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. In Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, according with the local regulation requirement, any company that acts as the license holder for the product, whether be it Cisema or your local distributor, or in the future you plan to set up your own local entity, this company have to be act as the principal importer as well. So our role in Indonesia, for example, is that we will be acting as the principal importer and deliver the products directly to your local appointed distributor once we have cleared the goods from the customs. And why a lot of manufacturers right now are trying to using third-party instead of finding a local distributor and setting up our own subsidiary. So in these slides, we're going to talk a bit about the benefits of each of this model. For example, if let's say, if you're using local distributor, while a local partner that is able to help you to manage all your end-to-end sales and distribution and help you to have faster commercialization, but it actually limits you over your market activities. Because, for example, in Indonesia, let's say earlier on the slides, I mentioned that one brand can only be registered by one company. So let's say in Indonesia, if you let the distributor hold a license and the distributor is not performing well, it means that it is very difficult for you to switch to another company, because in real life situation, many companies have informed that, the distributor is not performing well. They're having hard time, switch this license from one company to another. And of course, if you let the distributor register, which means that you have the increased IP and commercial exposure to them as well. So having a third party, which means that you have a flexibility to work with different partners in the region. So there will be no exclusive contracts and you have full control towards all your licenses. So in case, let's say, the performance of a local partner is not doing well, the license can be transferred to another entity as well. For own subsidiary wise, yes, some of the manufacturers can consider setting up their own subsidiary. While you have full controls over your market operations, you also need to ensure that this is a significant investment and a longer setup for your business in the region. So how can we help that as Cisema, how can we help to assist foreign manufacturers like your company in the Southeast Asia regions? So basically, if you want to enter Southeast Asia, there are tips for the Southeast Asia approval. First, you need to map out your strategy across the Southeast Asia, because just remember that one country's approval, you cannot sell in other countries. So for example, if you get approval in Malaysia, you can't sell the product in Singapore. So you need to map out accordingly, classify your product, whether it's a class B or C, because it will help to, the turnaround time in each countries will be different. Start with reference countries approval, leverage the Reliance program, appoint a local partner like us, plan for importation where required, for example, in Indonesia, and centralize your regulatory oversight. So what we do is that we assist on the pre-market registrations. We help with any medical device consultations, product classification if required, gap analysis for your product, provide local guidance. And our team will carry out the registration by preparing a full set of dossiers with the authority. And once we have successfully registered the product, we will just be issuing a letter to your local appointed distributor. In countries where we require us to import the product, we will be acting as your principal importer and deliver the goods directly to your local appointed distributor. And as a license holder, we will also be responsible in all the PMS support, such as the recall, field safety, corrective action, and mandatory problem reporting. And now over to you, Victoria.
Great. So just before we end the webinar, I'd like to share some news with you that we just released yesterday, is that Cisema has now expanded into South Korea. So we're offering registration and authorized representation services for medical devices, IVDs, and quasi-drugs. And please do visit our website for more information about these services. So just wanted to share that information with you. So does anybody attending have any specific questions? Please do post them in the Q&A box just at the top of your screen. If you have specific questions, maybe about a particular device that you're interested in registering in the area, or if you wish to contact us separately, then please do so. A couple of questions that do come up regularly is, Xiaozhen, do manufacturers need to be present in the market to actually hold a registration?
So basically, in Southeast Asia, each country's the license will be held by the local entities. So the manufacturers, in case they would like to hold their registration license in Southeast Asia, they need to set up a local entity in order for them to hold a license. But if you appoint a third party like us to hold a license, we are your third party license holder that give you a flexibility to work with different distributors in the country.
Okay, great. And is it possible that if I have a registration, a license at the moment, that you can actually change license holders in each of these markets?
Yes, in certain countries like Malaysia, Singapore, they have this change of ownership process, but manufacturers should be aware that in each of these countries, while there is a change of ownership, you need to get a consent from the current license holder, which is your local distributor. So if let's say the local distributor, they do not agree to change the license or transfer the license from one entity to another, then you're not able to carry out the change of ownership. In countries like Vietnam, there is no change of ownership process. And in Indonesia, while the license holder is allowed to change, be aware that you can change the license holder or the distributor, but the registration will be treated as a new registration. So we have to start everything from the beginning.
Right. So you mentioned in Vietnam, there's no change of license holders. Is that also starting from scratch?
Yes, correct. So let's say if the distributor is not doing well, and if you want to have this registration to be held by another company, then you have to start the registration with them again. Especially for high-risk medical devices, SaMD, it takes about 9 to 15 months for approval. So it is important for you to find a third party to avoid the 1.5 years gap.
Yeah. So obviously sort of the class A and B, where it's only 1 week to re-register, it's just a question of paying the fees again, and it's fairly quick.
Yeah.
But for obviously the higher risk class, it's going to take a long time to re-enter the market if you've used a distributor to be your license holder. Okay, great. Okay, well, we're coming to the end of the webinar now. So here you have Xiaozhen's contact details. So please do reach out to him because he's the one with all the knowledge about Southeast Asia. So we hope to hear from you in the near future if you have any questions about your products and devices for any of these 6 markets. And do check out Cisema's new website, which we cover now a good 10 markets in the Asia Pacific region. So looking forward to working with you. Thank you. Bye-bye.